right, good evening, everyone. Welcome back to Pump Up the Volume. You're joining us today. If you're joining us today for the first time, my name is Luis Daniel Munoz. I'm a medical doctor, previously independent gubernatorial candidate in the state of Rhode Island. I am joined today by two of my co-hosts. We usually have three fellow co-hosts. So Mr. Bill Bartholomew could not be with us today. He'll be joining us again next week. Usually gives us a weekly rundown of news and updates. So we'll have to try our best to reflect all the good reports that Bill has normally provided us on the show. But joining me today, in terms of my other fellow co-hosts, we have Mr. Scott Rotunda from WBOB 990. Again, independent media specialist and someone also who's out there on the ground in the city of Pawtucket and even beyond, and really advocating for communities and pushing the hard questions so that we're all informed, but also reflecting right on the changes that are taking place under our noses sometimes. We also have Mr. Pat Ford, co-founder of the Libertarian Party here in the state of Rhode Island, and also founder of the Coalition Radio Network, which we're actually streaming through. And so thanks so much for this opportunity, Pat. And what is Pump Up the Volume? What are we attempting to do here? So if you're joining us for the first time, really what we're doing is we're amplifying voices of the community. What does that mean, right? Which voices? Well, the truth is the voices that are being unheard, right? The questions that are being unanswered, the concerns that are being unaddressed. The show is really intended to lift those up and to have deep conversations around not only the challenges that we're faced with, but also providing some space for thinking through some pragmatic solutions to get us out of these deep, profound challenges that we're facing today, like COVID-19, as well as the economic crisis that is happening simultaneously, which will likely worsen over time. So for this week, we do have some things to touch on. I'm going to pretty much glance over a few things, and then we're going to have Scott give us a rundown of what's going on in national politics, just to add some levity to our daily lives, because as we know, national politics can turn into a bit of a circus these days. But in terms of Rhode Island, it's pretty clear that there's kind of miscommunication and disconnect between what the administration has been pushing over time in terms of what quarantine and isolation is versus what our current governor was showing the public that she was doing over the past week. So we can dive into what that means, why that happened, and why we should all take that disconnect very seriously in moving forward. Also, we have to talk about the numbers. We have Rhode Island is still one of 3 states in the United States of America that is at the top of the average daily positive cases of COVID-19 per 100,000. Rhode Island is only topped by Oklahoma and Tennessee. So please keep that in mind. We can dive into those numbers later. And just note that our percent positivity rate, and this is coming from the Rhode Island Department of Health website, is 8.9%, which is still very high. We've had total number of new positive cases since December 15th, totaling the 1,084, and we have 15 new fatalities. So our hearts go out to families that have lost loved ones. You're in our prayers, and my hope is that we can all take steps this winter to try to again reduce the transmission, protect our families, and ultimately get through this winter, because the vaccine, although it has come to Rhode Island, has only come for a few high-risk individuals and not for all of us. So please keep that in mind. So with that, that is actually an overview. That is not a deep dive, but it's enough for you to be aware that we're going to talk about these things. Now I want to hand it off to Scott, so maybe we can get a bit of a rundown on what's going on in the national front as well. Thanks, Scott.
Sure. On the national front, thank you very much, Dr. Munoz. Glad to kind of lead off here tonight. On the national front, the election that seems like it's never ended, or maybe hasn't ended for a certain segment of the population, let's just say, has officially been put to rest, because this week the Electoral College did vote and confirmed for about the umpteenth time President-elect Joe Biden's win over now outgoing President Donald Trump. I have a mixture of emotions about this. Overall, I feel great that our system of government worked the way that it's intended to, but I also feel some disgust. And why I feel that is, for instance, the state of Michigan actually had to close down their capital while the electors were voting because there were credible threats of violence. There were state senators in, I believe, Pennsylvania talking about just appointing different electors effectively because they didn't like the outcome of the election in their state. And that really did leave an awful taste in my mouth. You've got people running around saying that because the election didn't go the way they wanted, that there was fraud, that there was vote stealing, and any quantitative measure showed that it wasn't true. I'm just going to indulge myself for a moment here. Um, Someone had told me on Fox News that they had a very credible source that said there were almost 140,000 votes delivered in like a basket, if you will, all of them for Joe Biden, and that's proof right there of election fraud. So I actually dove into the numbers in Wisconsin, right? So first of all, Wisconsin had 8 congressmen. They got 2 senators and 8 congressmen if you for like 10 for their electoral votes. Of the 8 representatives that were running, 5 of them that were Republicans won, right? So that tells me, how could you possibly have vote fraud in Wisconsin to get Joe Biden over the top, but also put Republicans into office? And then you look at the total number of votes cast for president, because I said maybe, it could be someone just checked it for Biden 100-something thousand times and put it in the machine that way and didn't vote anything down ballot. But the delta between presidential votes and the votes for the congressional elections wasn't really all that much. And that was the case in all these states that we'll call them Cheeto Jesus decided to, and I credit Pat Ford for that, decided to challenge. So it just felt to me like a redo of 2016, where it was the other side that was unhappy with the results, and so it must have been fraud. What really incensed me, though, was last week the amicus brief that over 100 Republican congressmen signed on to on behalf of Texas, effectively saying they didn't like the way another state voted and it should be overturned. I've got no great love for the Democrats or the Republicans, but if I was Speaker Nancy Pelosi, those 100 Republicans that signed on to that, I would think long and hard about not seating them in the next session. And I'm not saying that to be spiteful. I'm saying that because as an elected representative, as a senator, as a representative, president, vice president, you name it, you swear an oath to the Constitution of the United States. That oath is not sworn to a party, and it sure as hell is not sworn to Donald J. Trump. And the fact that they were willing to take that all and throw it in the garbage disgusts me. Donald Trump, you can't leave office soon enough. This is someone who, and I think we're going to feel the effect for years to come, has undermined our democracy to the point that, I mean, everybody's going forward is just going to call, I think on both sides of the aisle, anything that they don't like, they're just going to call it fake news. And I think the ripple effect is unfortunately going to be felt for years to come. So on the one hand, I'm happy that our system of government worked the way it did. Well, one last point, people out there that say we should just have a popular vote. To hell with the Electoral College, right? What's happened with this election shows exactly why we need the Electoral College. Because let's imagine, if you will, a world where we didn't have the Electoral College. It was just a straight popular vote. So it wouldn't matter. My vote in Rhode Island, someone's vote in New Hampshire, my cousin's vote in Nevada. Who cares? A vote is a vote is a vote. Okay. That would then be taken out of the state's hands. It would probably be managed at the national level. Correct? Who would appoint the people that were in charge of this national, board of elections or whatever you wanted to call it? The president. I would trust gas station sushi. I would trust Casey Anthony running a daycare more than I would trust people who are in charge of counting the votes that were appointed by Donald J. Trump. Because in that case, you would have a situation where, like we had on election night, where Donald Trump came on after midnight, and I believe he was ahead in the popular vote at that point, and said, I won. If you didn't have the Electoral College, he could have stopped counting at that point and just went on for another 4 years. Where with our system of government, the way we have it now, the individual state said, nah, brah, we're not done yet. Okay, so that's kind of my national diatribe for now, and I thank you for the time.
It was a damn fine one.
Thanks for the rundown, Scott. And we can't forget that even there were even Democrats after Trump initially won that were asking for a change in the Electoral College system, right? So it's just interesting that you get the requests across the political spectrum. And what I think is interesting too is it's really fascinating to see Republican elected officials take a big government approach to this lawsuit that they were proposing, right? I mean, talk about taking power away from the states. That would have set precedent for all other types of litigation to follow. it's an interesting time in history. A bit of levity, I think, when you actually think about what they're doing. Awesome. So here we are. We have something going on the national stage, and certainly that has had an impact, likely, on what operationally will be this deployment implementation of like vaccine strategy, right? Like I don't understand how the Biden administration, by being kept out of those conversations now, is going to really mobilize around these efforts in an efficient way. So unfortunately, I think there's going to be a real impact that's going to, or a consequence, I would say, from what Trump is currently doing. In terms of where we are with COVID-19, let's put that out there. I want everyone listening to know this is not over. This is not over. People are still getting sick. The transmission rate of COVID-19 has not, obviously changed in a significant way. It has not mutated in terms of the virus itself, but it isn't stronger, but it isn't weaker. And in terms of healthcare resources, we're still in the flu season. We're still just approaching our first snowstorm in a couple of days here in the state of Rhode Island. And so it's likely going to be a long winter. Our hospital systems are still at risk of being overwhelmed, while fortunately our healthcare providers in those hospitals will have the vaccine, which I'm hoping provides them with immunity that's either lifetime immunity or at least a year's worth of immunity. But there's still questions, right? Questions about exactly that. How long is immunity for? How long will it take for the general population, right? A person that is not a healthcare worker, a person that is not a first responder, a person that is not above the age of 65, a person that does not have two diseases like diabetes and heart disease, right? How long will it take for a person that is pretty much has no remarkable health history or condition, for that person to get the vaccine? I can say that it's probably going to be late spring, at best, at worst early summer. And that's a long time. That's a long time where you're still going to be at risk, where just because you don't have underlying conditions doesn't mean that this will not have a toll on your lungs. And COVID scarring is actually becoming a thing. And long COVID is actually becoming a thing as well, where people are feeling this, still having some of the symptoms and difficulties in breathing months after the virus itself has resolved. So why am I kind of opening up with that in terms of where we are and what we're going into? Because once again, we have to just remember that here in the state of Rhode Island, despite the good news, a few doctors and nurses, even if a few is 1,000, thousands of doctors and nurses getting the vaccine does not in any way fix a broken contact tracing force. It does not in any way address the lack of food resources, right, for our communities. It doesn't fix those issues. So we need to continue to amplify our voices and to push our representatives, our local politicians, to advocate for our communities, our neighbors. So with that, I'm going to kind of throw it back out there to Scott and Pat. And, one thing I want to bring this back to is, we had an interesting example over the past 7 days where we pretty much had an entire administration, the people that are in front of the TV for 9 months telling us what to do, what not to do, suddenly all get locked down. And why do they get locked down? Well, we know that Dr. Alexander Scott was tested positive for COVID-19. Prayers go out to Dr. Alexander Scott. I hear she was not symptomatic, which is great. She's also a healthcare worker, so it's understandable why she would be at high risk. So this is not a blame game as to why Dr. Alexander Scott got COVID-19, but more so like what happens when someone gets COVID-19, especially with the people that they come into contact with, and what should those people that they've come into contact with actually do, right? So this all goes back to contact tracing and recommendations around quarantine and isolation. And what we saw was that the administration pretty much went on lockdown. Brett Smiley, Dr. Alexander Scott, and then the governor, went into quarantine. But despite news prior to, what was it, last Wednesday, I believe, just about. Yep. Prior to prior to the governor being seen in a restaurant, she had already received notice that Dr. Alexander Scott and Brett Smiley had been positive, and Dr. Alexander Scott, I think that same day actually tested positive. So the timeline is interesting there, because ultimately, if anyone in your administration tests positive as a governor in a state where you need to serve as a leader and optics matter, it's not the time to go out and have a glass of wine and do a painting where people could take pictures of you. That, from a leadership perspective, I'm not saying that, you shouldn't paint or have wine, have it in your home, but it was not the right timing. And then after, you would think that the governor would kind of take some accountability, some ownership over the optics of that. But the governor didn't do that. So this is a leadership thing again. Instead, the governor, to meet the the day that Biden was going to receive the votes for Rhode Island's electorates, is that the plural, or electorates, ends up going in a vehicle, gets driven to the Capitol. So again, clearly the governor does not really care what any of us think. And why does it matter? Why am I spending 3-4 minutes talking about this when we could be talking about data, healthcare, things that we can quantify that have a real immediate impact? Well, the reason I'm talking about this is this actually does have an impact, because we have COVID deniers out there. We have people that are seeing inconsistencies that they cannot logically understand from an economic standpoint. Some businesses that are being closed, others that are not. And even if there is reason underlying those differences, when they look at the optics of what the governor's doing, they start to just call everything out as being a show, right? Smoke and mirrors. And then what happens with what's the consequence of that? Well, the consequence of that is they start convincing other people in communities. These little echo chambers on Facebook become breeding grounds for dissent and for inadherence, right, to preventive measures, to recommendations that healthcare providers have provided. And that's concerning to me from a healthcare standpoint, because we have already seen the consequences of that. And if we continue to operate in that fashion into the holidays and into the remainder of this winter, I just don't know where we're going to be in 2 months. Independent of whether there's a vaccine out there, people will still get sick. People will still die. So that's what's on my mind. It's been weighing on me. Again, it's just optics, but optics at that level have a real impact on lives. So throw it out there. I know we've had some diverging opinions here, Pat, but happy to hear, Scott and Pat, your thoughts as well.
Well, you and I are going to agree this week and disagree on one level, because I believe that our governor, to a certain degree, abdicated any moral authority she has in demanding other people's compliance to these strict lockdowns. I'm going to read something, and reading is usually bad for this, but it's important because outlets like Channel 6 aren't even touching on this. Indoor recreation and entertainment facilities and operations must close during the pause. This includes, but is not limited to, indoor movie theaters, bowling centers, arcades, karaoke, pool billiards, music and performing arts performances, and comedy performances. Restaurants may not operate any recreation or entertainment activities and must prevent customer access to any such areas on site. One more time, and it's great, Arlo Guthrie would say, with feeling. Restaurants may not operate any recreation or recreation entertainment operations. Example, restaurants may remain open under applicable industry specific, but facilities that would lend themselves to entertainment, restaurants, and I'm quoting, must prevent customer access to any such areas on site. Pretty clear to me. Now, I'm going to use an example, and anyone who's ever vacationed on the Cape, or if you have a business on the Cape, or if you have a rental property on the Cape, you've been the victim of what they call Monday weather reporting. And Mr. Rotundo, I think you can attest to this. On Monday, Katarina bad weather, or whoever the weather goddesses of the moment it puts out the point that on Sunday it's going to rain cats and dogs, dogs and cats. Now, they're not really 100% sure of that, but they're going to put that out anyway. What impact does that have on business on the Cape for that weekend? Pretty tough. Shuts it right the hell down, doesn't it, Scott?
Yeah, absolutely it does. Yeah, because people don't want to travel back and forth in that, and now they have effectively a lost weekend.
Right, and as the sun has a beautiful sunset, it's a spectacular summer evening on a Saturday night. All the restaurant owners could have only think to what could have been. Now, what does that mean to this situation? The state of Rhode Island, the governor of Rhode Island, and a variety of authority figures have taken every opportunity over the last 8-9 months going on to rail against folks who would engage in, trite activities, leisure activities. They pointed out the dangers accordant with that, the dangers in not masking, the dangers in not social distancing. For the record, I'm not going to disagree with them. I take this disease very seriously. I do not consider it to be a scandemic. I do not consider it to be a hoax. A lot of people will be very, very ill with this. I know someone right now who is very, very ill at home. And when I say very, very ill, they're just miserable. Now, they can breathe, but there's a lot of fear there because they've lost their taste for food. And that's one of the walkaways from that. Imagine an entire life spent not being able to taste the wonderful foods that are available here in Rhode Island, like a tease. So when that governor turns around, and I forgave her for the Black Lives Matter thing, that was, of the moment, if you will. But after the events of the last 3 weeks, where we have literally talked ourselves in large part into a recession, where gyms have been obliterated, where businesses aren't getting that, with everything wrong associated with this pandemic. If you're a small business person, or even a moderately sized business, or even a large business, you are facing a near-death scenario right now. So for this governor to go out and, in spite of all those admonitions, 8 months of admonitions, to go out in the middle of I don't even call it the pause anymore, Scott, doctor. I call it the purge. So to go out in the middle of the purge and engage in a non-social distance, because it didn't look social distance to me. And by the way, for the record, guys, I was one of the first people to release the picture. And did I share it everywhere? Well, yes, I did. Is there a crisis in confidence in the governor and many portions across the state? All I can say is, you can quote one of the great TV moments in American history, the Shake and Bake commercial. Well, I helped. Simply because in the face of just incredible pain, folks dying, family members being separated, businesses, multi-generational business in Rhode Island sinking in before our eyes. For this governor to go out like that, there was a lot of doubt early on about the pictures. And I entertained a lot of doubt, despite the fact that I'd seen pictures of, of people with masks in that same environment. I made a few phone calls, and the event was going on that night. I just couldn't believe the sheer stupidity of it. This flies in the face of every single statement, action, edict, recrimination, borderline assassination that's taken place in the state of Rhode Island since March. It is unfathomable to me how someone could engage in this behavior when she, 3 days prior, begged people. I was in the room to stay home, to have dinner home. There was a point where my good friend John could tell you, I was speechless. Imagine. So guys, I got to tell you, I'm watching the news media, friendly news media to the administration massage this. I'm looking at them step past the obvious points and focus on the fact that she was at a restaurant. You could be at 33% at a restaurant.
You know why they step past it, though, don't you, Pat?
Well, because they worship at the altar of access.
Well,
that's what they do.
What would happen? I mean, theoretically, pick any news outlet. I don't mean to step on your time. I apologize for that.
No, go ahead, buddy.
Any news outlet. And if they ran with it, just whatever one in your head, because I don't want to damn anybody, but your favorite news outlet, and they ran with it and they questioned her on it. Rhode Island is a one media market area. It's not like California where you got Sacramento, Los Angeles, San Francisco, San Diego. It's Providence, and that's it. And we have one party rule here, and I think one party rule by any party is terrible. So all they would have to do is hold her feet to the fire on that, and it would be like Michael kissing Fredo. It will be the kiss of death, and they will be shut out of all the inside, all the halls of power. All their scoops will go away. And for instance, like WJAR, where they have a lock on the market, they'd become irrelevant because they would have no access to the inside anymore. That's why.
And the sad part is, it's through strength that you gain true access. Go ahead, buddy.
I wish that were just it. But in addition to that, Scott, we just have to recognize the governor, this is her last term, right, as governor. So this would be the time. This would be the time to push the hard questions. Even, what is a loss of access in 12 months? Probably maybe significant, but the truth is, I doubt in a time of a pandemic anyone can be completely locked out without there being some consequences and fallout to doing that, right? And we see that. We see the DePietros ending up in these in these pressers, right? They're not keeping anyone out. So my concern is that the mainstream media outlets, Channel 12 is one of them. I'll call them out. They were letting people into debates when I was running. They were independents and not letting me in. It's a pro-establishment platform, and at the end of the day, it enables this elitist, I would say, elitist approach to communications, right? Where ultimately communications are dictated, they're framed in ways that are conducive to the current establishment, and anything that threatens that is kept out. That's really what it is. And so we got to call this for what it is. And I'm mentioning this because there were a few posts on Facebook today from community activists. And I want to lift up what they were saying. There are these kind of pro-left media platforms, right? These pro-racial justice advocates on the ground that pretty much operate under this umbrella of privilege every day of their lives. Then they want to march beside communities. They want to selectively choose the stories to talk about that suit their particular narrative for their particular ratings. But when the real story begins to build out, and that story circles back onto whether it's the administration not having sufficient, equitable allocation of resources, or whether a media platform is actually not raising up women of color that are running for elected office compared to white men, right? When that story begins to build out, it gets shut down. And I know that I went on a bit of a tangent here, but I think it's important. I just wanted to add this element that there are media outlets that are very intentional with what they're doing. And it's unfortunate that level of privilege in terms of a mindset persists in a time, especially in this time, when it's, when racial and, social justice have really been magnified and put at the forefront. And yet still we see these outlets operating the same, which from my perspective tells me that the only thing that can change in that equation is state leadership, is someone coming in and allowing media outlets and expecting media outlets to put them to the fire, but also doing the same to the media outlets themselves when they're essentially creating, when they're creating stories and expecting you to kind of run away. Courage from leadership and just giving the answers is also a way to change that behavior. But we haven't seen that, right? I think we see some of it on some municipal levels, but I don't think we've seen it at the state level.
Well, there is still a significant amount of time left in her reign of terror, if you will. You've got, we're halfway into the. Scott, correct me. Are we time has become the time-space compendium has been destroyed. Are we halfway through her second term? I believe.
We are, yeah. I mean, 2022 will be when we vote in a new governor.
Mm-hmm. And the election will effectively begin probably in another. I would bet by St. Patrick's Day you start to hear early announcements and you start to see serious semi-public fundraising.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, Dr. Munoz, to your point about the media, the reason why all these various independent media platforms have been able to gain a toehold in Rhode Island is because of the pathetic performance of the mainstream media. There was a time when Jim Taricani was still a young man, Jack White was still with us, where folks broke stories. Now the media largely reacts to stories that are, well, announced for them. They get the call that the perp walk is going to go down on someone, and that's when we hear this flurry of reporting, and then we see the new commercials with the serious, very, very serious shots of news reporters. And again, there's a certain movie about a guy in San Diego that shows you exactly what a clown parade that is. But they all have the investigative teams. They all got the same LL Bean jackets, and they've got those steely looks into the camera. Says, "Watch out! I may actually call you to follow you up on that press release you sent me." Yeah, that's what reporting goes for in this state. It just doesn't simply exist. So that's why independent media, whether it be the Motifs, the Bill Bartholomew podcast, whether it be Uprise or Rhode Island, if media is doing their job, those simply really don't have any space to exist. They just don't.
BOB 990, let's not forget.
Right, the coalition. I mean, all of that. They just simply don't exist. And I'm going to be blunt. I think if you consider Jim Hummel to be independent media, and I know he's sort of on the borderline there, but he does operate his own platform very, very successfully, and he's managed to find a way to, gain significant shelf space, if you will, on some of the existing traditional media platforms. But if you go to one of those press releases, whether it be Bill or Jim, and I'd like to think me, and a couple of other people, most of the questioning, the reporting done at those forums is independent media. Channel 10's got a presence. Other than that, at WPRO.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, independent media, in a lot of ways, what I've noticed is that, I mean, there's just more courage reflected in the questions, right? I mean, what do you have to lose, right? You're there. Ask the question versus you're not answering to a producer, an executive producer, a board of directors. I mean, there's just this, on one level, there's this micro management that probably takes place in some institutions. On another level, though, I do think that those that have risen to the top, that have become like the representatives of like a WPRI, I think that they embody what the board wants, right? I've seen these individuals operate in a way where it's just like consistently not asking a hard question, consistently like just avoiding any conversation about a narrative that isn't what's catchy for the day.
Right.
So so again, I mean, there's hope. Yeah. So, yep. You were saying
something? I was just going to say they're more likely to ask about the minutia or the operations surrounding the reaction to COVID than the very nature of the reaction to COVID, who's getting support in COVID, and what the question should be regarding the economics of COVID. That's what you get. You'll get questions about further explanations. If on this Sunday, Mr. Rotundo, you are not allowed to have peas. However, next Sunday, on alternate days ending in Y, you can have peas. Well, excuse me, Madam Governor, do you mean peas as in French cut peas, or do you mean pea soup? That's the kind of questions you're getting, and it's kind of embarrassing, really, at this point.
You, Jim Hummel, Motif Magazine, Bill Bartholomew. I mean, you're all asking the questions, right? In terms of like what the economic impact is, how regulation is going to impact businesses, is there going to be funding to support? I mean, the angle through which those questions are coming, I mean, are a little different, which we've had some interesting conversations over the last couple of weeks, but the questions are getting out there. So here's the thing. Here, I know that we've kind of fallen back into this criticism of mainstream media, and I think that that it was worthwhile to do that. But moving forward, I guess here's the question: what is the impact of this, the heroism in the narratives taking place through mainstream media, right? Like the doctor who has the vaccine is here, Rhode Island gets the vaccine, and somehow again disregarding the fact that we're still one of the 3 states that are seeing more positive cases per 100,000 than any of the other states. What impact will that have? And I'm interested in hearing from both of you. But Scott, you haven't spoken in a little. So what do you think, Scott? Like, what is going to be the impact of that when you have a WPRI putting all of these feel good stories out about the vaccine when the average person doesn't even know if they're going to have access to it?
Well, I think the feel good aspect of it is people will, and I hope this doesn't happen. I think they'll start to almost loosen up, throw caution to the wind a little bit, figuring, well, there is a light at the end of the tunnel, and it's kind of being misrepresented to them how close that light at the end of the tunnel is to them. So they might say, well, I'm not going to be as careful anymore. I'm not going to wear my mask as much outside, and I know I'm supposed to wear my mask when I'm around people that aren't in the house with me. But I'm just going over my neighbor's house for a beer, so so who cares? And I think that kind of deceptiveness, if you will, in the media, in maybe I'm phrasing it a little bit wrong, but the overstating of this vaccine is actually going to lead to a bigger uptick in cases again, because people are going to, you hear the vaccine, they think, well, we're going to line up this Sunday at CVS on Smithfield Avenue and all get it, and it don't work that way, son. To your point, so I think you will see a lot of loosening up in that case, and you'll see the rates unfortunately spike even more, and people will lose their lives because of that.
That's a great point, Scott. I hadn't really thought about that. You've got this. I mean, the people that I'm surrounded with in the bubble that I exist in are so cynical about vaccines in general, and it's that ultimately I wouldn't have thought really about the halo effect. Are people going to ease up even further, to your point, because, well, happy days are here again? And that I'll always mention, I got to find the clip somewhere because I use it on the show here. But years ago, there was a Shirley Temple movie, Dr. Munoz, long before your time. Shirley Temple movie, and she's playing the poor child. One of her stock parts was to play the poor child in the Depression. And these movies came out at the height of the Depression. And then all of a sudden, about halfway through the movie, they break through what would be called the fourth wall when she marches out onto a stage and goes, "Everybody, I've got news. The Depression's over." And the curtain peels back, and you've got this Busby Berkeley style dance number, with hundreds of dancers singing "Happy Days Are Here Again." You're right. I wonder if this skewed reporting on the well, and let me ask you a question, Scott and Doctor. With all the reporting, with all the issues out there surrounding this, how come the television networks feed us such pablum? That's a serious question. I'm going to throw that out to both of you. With all the issues that they could be covering around this, why?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I knew. I mean, I think if you look at media as an organism attempting to survive in a competitive environment, every organ in that organism has to be coordinated. And so what that tells me is that while we may only see WPRI, it's owned by a conglomerate that owns other media outlets, right? And so overall, I think that these efforts, these narratives, while we only see one window into it, right? We see the frame that's coming through the screen in Rhode Island. It's likely a coordinated effort across multiple media, organizations that are owned by the same conglomerate, or company. Yeah, so from a business perspective, that's the only thing that makes sense to me, because otherwise, like it does, it doesn't make sense that the stories aren't nuanced. It doesn't make sense that they're not, much more invested in Rhode Island. It's interesting to say this, but yeah, I would say actually that if you look at WPRI, it is actually split, right, between Massachusetts and Rhode Island. I mean, it's like, it seems deep, but it's not very deep. The stories are not really the Jim Hummel long forms that we'd hope to see.
Hmm. Hmm. Wow. There is Rudy Cheeks, who writes in the now generational column, Felipe and Jorge would say it at a moment like this: sleep tight, Rhode Island. Sleep tight.
Mm-hmm.
Technically, no, it would be sleep tight, Rhode Island. Sleep tight. He's got a unique perspective. I just wonder where we go from here, because the governor's out of gas.
So here's where we are then.
So go ahead, buddy.
So, well, where we are is, this is why we have this live stream, right? This is why each of us does something like this. And we're coming together now to really even try to amplify what we've talked about in other mediums even more. So tomorrow I have I'm in the Equity Council for Rhode Island. I'm a member of Rhode Island Governor's Equity Council, and they're going to be giving us an update on the plan for vaccines. So I'm interested in getting some data back, and hopefully we can share something with you all next week. But in the meantime, I think what's important to recognize is please do not be swayed by feel-good stories. Embrace it for what it is. It's a feel-good story. There is hope. We talked about that hope here. But even in the hope for the vaccine, the healthcare crisis is not the only crisis that we're facing. There are other things that need to take place. Do not let up on this administration. Continue to push for what we know we need. The state of Rhode Island will be in dire need for jobs next year. The state of Rhode Island will need to continue to fund social support programs, especially around food. Poverty is a war that we have not won in this country, and we'll continue to try to tackle in some way. I think that there are creative ways of doing that with public and private approaches. But again, we have to do work. Please don't let up and think that things are going to return to normal. I don't think if we're, I think the last estimate I heard from an economist was about 6 to 8 years before Rhode Island's economy returns to what it was before COVID-19. So just put that in perspective. The first aim is to survive. The second is to thrive. And so let's continue to think through how we can effectively do that. Continue to challenge this administration, ask the questions, push your leaders to ask the questions as well, especially those leaders that are reps and counselors that you only see once every 2 years. They should be working to get your questions up to this administration. So that's my 60 seconds. I'm going to take it sooner rather than last. And I'd like to end with Scott today. So Scott, you'll have the last word. Pat, how about you lift up what you're going to be doing over the next week?
Well, we have a show here on the Coalition Radio Network every Wednesday evening at 7 o'clock. A truly inspirational individual leads it. Her name is Tina Peterson. It's called RAMP, Real Access Motivates Progress. And it is an amazing 45 minutes or so. She's had, she herself, because of a mid-surgery stroke, has found herself, and I will never use the word confined, but finds herself reliant, if you will, on a wheelchair to get about. So she has dedicated her life now to providing information, resources, support, contacts for people who find themselves physically challenged. In a way that I never could have contemplated. I met, first time we had on the show was just as a guest, and she's a dynamo. She's had the Secretary of State, Nellie Gorbea, on the show. She has had Jim Langevin on the show in a very poignant 1 hour. She's had folks from Rhode Island state government, the federal government, all sorts of support groups. That's Wednesdays at 7 o'clock Eastern time. If you have someone in your family who finds themselves in these circumstances, or you do yourself personally, it is the best 45 minutes that you can spend every week. You'll be inspired and you will be informed. And that's tough to do these days. So I would commend that to everyone else's attention. We just released at the coalitionradionetwork.com on the Facebook page a compendium of the top hits of what I call my weekly date with Gina. And you'll see a very nice picture of her reading a children's book, which is what she effectively does to us every week. I actually find her very charming in person. She's obviously a very, very intelligent individual. We just disagree politely on literally, well, everything. So I'd ask you, if you want, about a dozen of them are up there, 2 to 3 minutes, amusing. Some of them are older, from the beginning, if you will, towards the beginning of the crisis, and you can watch them and you can, if you will, judge based on that. Final plug on the coalitionradionetwork.com. We've got some links. We're going to be doing sort of a little bit of fundraising effort right after the Christmas holidays. We are an organization that's based largely on advertising and sponsorships. This is not an inexpensive operation to run, so we would just ask folks to, in these difficult times, if they can, if they would like to sponsor shows, if they would like to respond to any one of the advertising links that we've got on the front page, it's little bits of money from a lot of people that will make this effort run, and we hope grow into the near year. We've got 2 shows lined up that we're going to be adding. We'll talk more about them after Christmas. Thank you again, Doctor, for leading us tonight.
Thank you, Pat. Scott?
All right. Well, last but not least, I guess. So, yeah, you can catch me every Monday on 990wbob.com. My show, The Rotunda. I try to bring issues to the forefront, as Dr. Munoz has talked about. Lately, it's been a lot of talking about the outgoing administration and just the assaults on Lady Liberty, if you will. I am hoping to branch out from that now that it appears to have finally been settled, and start handicapping the statewide races for 2022, because it's going to be interesting.
Awesome. Thanks, Scott. And best for last, Scott. Best for last. So thanks, gentlemen, again. Looking forward to next week as well, where Bill will be joining us again. So there'll be 4 of us here. And to everyone out there, I've been trying to end on a positive note. And there are things to be positive about, right? We have the holiday season coming up, and whatever holiday you celebrate, and even if you don't, my hope is that you can all share time with family, that you can have a moment to share some good food and stories, and just know that while we're still in this, we were 4 or 5 months ago looking out into the future without any real certainty about what would happen or how long it would take to get a vaccine. And there was, I guess that was a dark place. So where we are today is actually a bit brighter. There's light peeking through. Let's not be impulsive at this time, but certainly embrace that warmth. And my hope is that you can do it with family. All right. Well, I hope you all have a great week, and we'll be in touch next Tuesday here on Pump Up the Volume. Thanks.